First of all, I want to welcome everyone to the KEMA Coffee Break. I'm Liz Hess. I'm your host today. It looks like we have a great group. We're up to 18 participants, and it seems like a few are joining us yet. So for those of you that it may be your first time joining, KEMA Coffee Breaks are sessions focused on providing virtual information in a casual environment to emergency management professionals through the Keystone Emergency Management Association coffee breaks. So as I said, my name is Liz Hess. I'm currently the Central Regional Director of Emergency Management at WellSpan Health, and I'm the committee chair for the KEMA Mentorship Committee. As I said, KEMA coffee breaks are kind of virtual sessions, and they're meant to be informal for us to all learn from each other. And we started them back in spring of 2020, kind of as a means of facilitating engagement and education among KEMA members and the broader field. We're focused on providing unique perspectives directly from practitioners and the continual learners in our field and beyond. So today we have two great speakers, Rick Christ and Dave Bjorkman, who are going to talk about planning. But before we get into that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob, the Vice President of KEMA, for a little intro.
Yeah, I don't see President Bud Mertz on the call. I'm the Vice President of the organization. I do see some other board members. Amy Marie from Butler County is our secretary. And I think I saw Tanya Hook, who is now the Eastern Area Director. If I missed anybody, I apologize for that. But I asked Liz just to do a quick, let everyone know, a little announcement that for 2022, we're going back to an in-person conference. We're going back to Altoona at the Blair County Convention Center, and that's going to run from October 22nd through the 25th. Registration won't open for a little while, but I'm putting the website in the chat for everyone. We have opened the call for speakers. So if there's something that you want to submit as a proposal to the review committee and be part of the basically conference faculty. We've also opened, for those of you that are maybe from the private sector, we've opened our sponsorship and vendor opportunities also. So you can check out those opportunities and see if you want to help be part of our conference and help that. I also want to know, and I know Molly Doherty from PEMA's on, so I have to say that thanks to her and everyone else at PEMA headquarters. They're actually partnering with us to present this conference this fall. So we're glad to be back in person, and I'll let Liz take over as the host of the coffee break, and I'll let you guys, your speakers go. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you. I'm sure a lot of us are excited to be back in person. That's great. Glad to hear that. All right, so today I'm going to let Dave and Rick, you could kind of introduce yourselves and give us a background. So Rick, I'll start with you.
Hi there. I'm a firefighter by calling. That's my background, and it was that and my work in wilderness search and rescue that got me sent to the lower ninth ward of New Orleans after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. And I had the same revelation that I'm sure everybody had down there, which is how could a city so obviously prone to this exact kind of disaster be so totally unprepared? And then it hit me, because everybody's like me. I had spent my entire career in response mode, right? No, I didn't do preparedness. I didn't do prevention. We have a bear for that. I didn't do recovery. And so I decided I need to change and started getting into preparedness. My first foray into that was to become an exercise practitioner, a master exercise practitioner at EMI. I've since gone on to learn more about training and planning, and those are my specialties now. I do a lot of work for the District of Columbia's Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency under contract to them. In fact, my boss, Emily Rush, is here in the conference, and I hope will speak up when I present my part of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Super excited for your discussion today, Rick. Dave, if you could introduce yourself.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Rick. Hi, everyone. Rick, you came from the fire service. I came from the police side of things. So my background's law enforcement. And then I transitioned into specifically the public health and healthcare side of emergency management. I actually started during the last the often forgotten pandemic, 2009, 2010, H1N1. I started in consulting then. I then went into the practitioner side. I was a healthcare emergency management coordinator at a hospital down in Baltimore. And I currently teach full-time at the Pennsylvania College of Technology in their 4-year undergraduate degree program in emergency management and homeland security. I'm the lead faculty for the emergency management program. So in a variety of capacities, I've been in planning, both from a practitioner side, full-time consulting, and I still do part-time consulting on the side. Working a lot with healthcare organizations, but I've worked with county emergency management. And over the last couple of years, I've started getting into school K-12 work, as well as even working with churches as well too. So running the gamut of different organizations that I've done planning with specifically, among other things. I see a lot of planners on here, a lot of you I do know, see a lot of you that I know by name. So I think this will be a good discussion from a bunch of people who enjoy emergency planning. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you, Dave. There's a few of his students, including myself, on the call right now. I see Josh Walter and Cameron at least. So we're excited to hear about CPG 101 since you preached that to us so thoroughly. Okay, so we're gonna get into the session. Dave, I'm gonna start with you and you can kind of give us an intro to planning.
Okay. So I know I only have a few minutes, so I'll keep this brief. I know most of them, all of us are planners on here, but do you have the, okay, great, there. So in case you weren't aware, I'm sure most of us are, CPG 101 or Comprehensive Preparedness Guide 101 is currently in its 3rd iteration. We was last November, incidentally, or October, the 3rd version came out from FEMA. What happened to be right in the middle of my disaster planning class, so I had to switch things around a little bit. So at the college, I'm going to speak a little to that, how I explain planning. I teach a disaster planning 3-credit course at the college, and think of it like G235 on steroids across 16 weeks of academic instruction, where we have the academic side of things blended with the practical side of things, learning planning. So students have to learn CPG 101, both the actual process as well as what's now called the function-focused format, which used to be called the traditional functional format in CPG 101. I'm sure Liz and Rick and all of us will speak to that a little bit later. One of the first things I do when I start working with a client is not go through the CPG 101 process as we see it defined. Is a lot of times when I'm speaking to K-12 and when I'm speaking with churches and other smaller organizations, they have no idea what emergency planning is or how to even go about getting ready to plan for some type of emergency, XYZ emergency. And so one of the things that I tell students, and I make them do that, but when I'm working with clients, I do the same thing, is that if you go to that the next slide, Liz, is I make them have, I'm sorry, the following slide, and we're going to go back to this one. My apologies. I actually make them do an elevator speech. So when I'm working with a client, they often, well, what is this whole planning process? What does it mean? What does it mean? And I say, imagine you go into an elevator. We've all heard that 30-second elevator pitch. If you had to explain to a stakeholder or client, what is emergency planning? Why do I have to buy into this? How's it going to help me? Well, I say have that 30 seconds in your back pocket to kick off that conversation with that client, with that stakeholder partner. And I predicate on summing up CPG 101 planning process in a sentence or two. Now, this is not a perfect definition that you see on the screen. We can add to it, we can amend it, but this is basically what I explain, folks. I say, you know, we're doing this because emergency planning is an ongoing, collaborative, team-centered process, emphasis on team-centered process, where we seek to identify and understand both our organizations and our stakeholder partners, their core roles and responsibilities, the resource requirements and information needs during a disaster to ensure that they can meet that continued state of readiness. And again, we can all have our own elevator speech, our own little pitch, but this is the general speech that I use with clients when I start working with them in this process. Before we even get into it, explaining why we need to plan with them. I'm sure you've all done that. You've all had those questions. Well, why are we doing this? What does this mean? Sometimes it's trying to get them to buy in. Sometimes it's just they don't know. And so explaining to them, much like I explain to students, and I have them do it in classes, how can you explain prep planning in a nutshell? So if you go back one slide, Liz, you'll see that CPG 101, again, I know you're all aware probably of the update, but I have the crosswalk, top and bottom. Top is the current version of CPG 101's planning process, how we develop, ultimately get to that emergency operations plan. And below is the version or the second version, which was from 2010. So we've gone about 10, 11 years between updates. Having read both of them, and again, we'll have this conversation later, I think that the changes haven't been significant or substantial. However, notably in part 2, understanding the situation, we'll see some verbiage and other changes in there. So when I speak to students and when I speak to clients, I focus on part 2, those changes, ultimately speaking to the same terms and concepts, hazards, risk, etc. in there. So once they get through that elevator speech, I'm going to use examples of working with the school as well as the church, because I actually really enjoy working with smaller clients or clients who are the non-traditional public safety or emergency management agencies that don't do this for a living. I really enjoy working with them and planning with them. So if you go back to the process or the process itself, again, I focus on planning. I enjoy starting from scratch. I know we have, side by side, we can do the revision or we can do the start from scratch. I've traditionally started from scratch, from nothing, working with a lot of my clients. And that's why I teach students. If you go into an organization and there's no plan in place, how do you start from scratch and go there? Well, forming your core planning team, identifying those stakeholders. Internally at the hospital, we had a robust planning. I think there was about 14 or 15 of us on our core planning team, representing a variety of support services, as well as medical side of the house as well too. And I really appreciate the engaging the whole community. We know it's a tremendous concept now on emergency management, engaging that whole community approach for emergency management. Thinking about all those stakeholders who might not be directly involved in any type of response or day-to-day, or any type of, but what kind of resources and what type of information and what type of planning needs they have within our community. I think that really plays out in understanding the situation a little bit. So if you go to that next slide, Liz, and I know I'm going through this quickly, but there's a couple key things that I want to hit on. When we're talking about understanding the situation, again, I go back to educating people up front. When I'm working with a new client, I take it for granted sometimes, and I've gotten away from it. They don't even know what a hazard is. So understanding what is a hazard. So if you go to that next slide, is understanding risk. I educate people on what's a hazard. So I give a perfect example. When I was working with a school district, I say, hey, well, we're doing our HVA. I know what people very often refer to it now as the threat hazard identification and risk assessment. And I know people still traditionally use the HVA, so I'll use those interchangeably. But we're talking about the hazard vulnerability assessment as part of the planning process for developing the school's EOP. And I say, well, what has happened in your school? What hazards? And they're like, well, nothing really. Nothing. I'm like, what do you mean nothing? I say, well, listen, a hazard is something that could potentially impact school operations. We tend to think of the big broad, the big bangs, the mass casualty incidents, all those different things. I say, take a step back, think about things that have disrupted operations. Well, then we start thinking about, and that just opened up the floodgates. Well, we had a chemical spill. We had a flood that went down the middle of the school. They had an animal intrusion. They had a car accident in front. They've had power outages. They've had delays and all those things. But what's interesting, what do you think the first two things that they thought of before we got it? They thought of fire, which I don't think any student in Pennsylvania in the last 50, 60, 80 years has been killed by a fire. And they thought of active shooter. So both fire and active shooter they thought of immediately. But after that, they're scratching their head. Well, nothing's really happened at our school. So talking to them about what is a hazard? What does a hazard mean? And things that have the potential to cause harm and that might impact organizational operations. Also, when I talk about HVAs, I talk about the need that they are extremely subjective or qualitative, but we do our best in HVAs or the thyroid process to make them as quantitative or data-driven as possible. I think that's very important. Informing our HVAs or risk assessments, our thyroids, with actual quantifiable risk-driven data. And I think that's very important. Now, we have a lot of resources as planners. I know you all know the resources out there, but I tend to gravitate towards the National Risk Index. I think it provides a good national, state level, county level, and municipal level just overview of the types of hazards and risks within the community. So if you haven't checked out the National Risk Index, it's relative, I think over the last 2 years, it's a really good resource for planners, as well as a resilience analysis and planning tool. I think that's also an excellent tool for us as planners to just get a sense of risk and the type of vulnerable populations, infrastructure, all those things that are within our community as well too. So if you haven't checked out any of those resources, I would encourage you to do so. And I know in our conversation, you're probably going to bring up some additional resources that you use as well too. That second part, again, Liz, I'm not going to cover all this only because, 10, 12 minutes, but I think step 2 is arguably the biggest change, and I would argue that it's one of the most important, using what we find within the risk analysis, that fire and HVA, to drive our emergency planning, our priorities, our objectives, our resource needs, among other things as well too. So if you scroll down, I'm just going to hit a couple more highlights. And determining goals and objectives. I know I have a couple more slides, but I'm only going to touch on a couple more things, and then I'll pass it over to Rick. So I know spare time. One of the things I think is very hard for planners, especially for me, I'll start with me, and I tease the other police officers, fire, and first responders, is that we're very on-scene, objective-driven on-scene. And one of my students this year said to me, how do I stop thinking like a first responder and start thinking like an emergency planner? I said, well, first of all, remove yourself from the scene, the specific incident objectives you want to accomplish as a first responder, and think about the bigger picture. Think about that. And what are your priorities from that next level, that higher level, that we call it the 10,000 foot level, 50,000. I know we've all said that. And understand that there's a difference when we're planning from EOP objectives and incident objectives, and this is straight from CPG 101. What the incident objectives for on scene, what we want to accomplish for a scene-specific, incident-specific type event, versus our EOP objectives, serving as a foundation for our EOP. Why are we writing this? What are the goals and objectives of our EOP? And I think that's very important as planners to understand that difference. We're not responders, we're emergency managers, but we also have to understand both and how they play off one another as well too. And lastly, Liz, if you skip through the develop the plan, that's really the guts of writing the plan. I'm sure that'll come out in our conversation. The students in my program, they learn what was once called the traditional functional format, TFF, in this version 2 of CPG 101. They have to memorize that structure as well too. I know part of our conversation will be about, well, what structure do we actually use, depending on agency, hazard, etc. Now we call it the function focus in the version 3. And so I teach students, and working with clients, we review and we use the function focused format for the structure of their base emergency operations plans. And I always say, if you can write a base emergency operations plan following the traditional functional format, you can write any plan in this field. If you have the base, if you know the planning process, you can be an effective planner, because basically it mimics going through annexes, etc., mimics that process. So Rick, I wanted to turn over to you. I know I'm running with 15 minutes. So Rick, I'd turn it over to you to fill in some of my mistakes and gaps.
No mistakes or gaps that I know of. In fact, you set up perfectly what I want to present. So thanks for that. I don't know if you want to take a couple questions now, or Liz, do you want people to hold them? I'm comfortable with interruptions, but you're the host.
Yeah, that's actually a good idea. Does anyone have any questions specifically to Dave and kind of the intro to planning, or comments? Everyone's probably multitasking and can't get to the mute. Well, if you think of anything, throw it in the chat and we'll get to it after Rick's.
Thanks. So let's just jump to the next slide. And one of the things that's a big concern for planners everywhere is lining up all of the different standards that a plan has to meet. And in this example, for example, we have 7 lifelines from FEMA, If you just look at response, 15 core capabilities, 15 emergency support functions, 29 EMAP standards, how do you write a plan that you can then use to address each of those things for both upward reporting and outward requests for assistance? Well, a mathematician would tell you, use the least common denominator, right? If you've got 3 pizzas and 8 people, find what is that, you know, what, 24, divide those pizzas up into 24 slices and everybody can get an equal one. So that's really what we did in DC to create what we call missions and service plans. And on the next slide, what you'll see is an example or an illustration of a service. A service is that least common denominator of our approach to emergency management. For example, I'm going to talk about the service of sheltering throughout the next few minutes, because all of us understand what sheltering is. Sheltering in DC and in your community probably has a single agency that is lead that owns it. That's essential. That's who we call. There are definitions of what sheltering means. For example, it has to be equitable, accessible. There are those kinds of things we build in. There needs to be a trigger. I'll talk about some of the details of a service plan in just a minute. Also surrounding that white box in the center that says service at the top, you'll see on the right, dependent services. When we have sheltering, we probably need to feed people in the shelter. Feeding, though, is its own service. It's dependent, in this case, to sheltering, but there are many other situations where feeding would be a necessary service. It's not owned by the same player, and so we count that as a separate service, which is dependent, in this case, to service. So is site security, so is medical assessment. There could be a number of them. At the bottom, you see what's the outcome. We're either serving residents or we're serving another agency that's serving the residents. That's really the definition of what a service is. Bottom half of that box is about POETI, and we're going to talk about POETI in its own slide in a minute, because to me, that's the beauty of this whole plan. On the next slide, you see just real short, these are the things we need in emergency operations plan or emergency operations center to know about the services. We don't need to know how the lead agency is going to provide service, sheltering to the resident. It's not our job. Our job is to understand what they need from us and from other agencies in order to deliver the service, what information they're going to need. David, in his elevator pitch, said, planning is about what are the resource and information needs that your partner and stakeholder organizations have. That's exactly what we're trying to drill down to here. And so it has maybe some dependent services. Of course, there's a concept of operations. There are critical tasks in there that we need to understand. We have a target. For example, it could be within 6 hours, we want to establish sheltering for up to 2,000 people and maintain that for 72 hours. You put your own target capabilities on there based on your hazard assessment, but it's important to have that so that we can know what POETI elements we need to bring into account to make that happen. Again, critical information requirements. If we call that lead agency and said, we need you to invoke the sheltering plan, we can predict some questions they're going to have, right? Even in this room, how many people? Where in town are they? What unique needs might they have? For example, if we're evacuating a nursing home, that might have some different needs than if we're evacuating a hotel. On the next slide, we break out what this is for sheltering operations. So the trigger, 10 or more displaced residents, some of the dependent services, we just answer all that. Basically, a service plan needs only this information. Now, on the next slide, this is the one that made me fall in love with this concept. Yeah, I'm a POETI geek, no question about it. If you look at sheltering, you say, what do we need to make sheltering work? We need a plan. Okay, we have a plan. We've defined, in this example, 20 sheltering teams. That's an AM and a PM shift at 10 different shelters, right? In this hypothetical example, we have one, so we're only 5% of the way towards being organized. if a shelter, we have facilities and we've identified all 10 of those, but we only have a trailer with all the stuff we need. We only have one of those and we really need 10. So I know this is 60%. In my mind, we're 10% in terms of equipping, because we can only equip one shelter with one trailer. We need to train both managers and the staff. We've got a training plan for the managers, so we're 50% at a training level. And we determined we need to do 3 exercises. We've already done 2 this year, so we're 65, 67% through that. What this tells me is that on any given day, I can get up, as I do every morning. I get up and I look at my risk assessment. Then I look at the news, I look at the weather, and I see, how do I have to change my focus on the risk assessment today? And if I don't have urgent response things that I need to work on, I can say, well, hurricane on the horizon, what missions might we have to invoke? What services do those missions involve? And how well prepared am I? And what can I do to move that needle most effectively? If I've got grant money left over, let's get a couple more trailers. If I've got some training budget, let's get that training course developed, or let's get the staff organized. Those are the things that are going to move the needle a lot more than one more exercise, right? That's simple math. So this tells us exactly where we can go to improve preparedness on a steady state basis or a just-in-time basis as particular hazards loom, as they so often do in DC. Next slide shows how we group services together for a particular mission. We've identified a couple dozen missions. For example, debris management is a mission, and it includes multiple services. Debris removal is the most obvious service, but we also need site security. We need hazardous materials most of the time when we're doing debris removal. And all those services together are part of a mission. So that's how they interact and how we can summarize and bring them together to make it work. In fact, on the next slide, here's how we tie it back to hazards. See, we don't have a hurricane plan in the district. What we have is a playbook that says, if we're anticipating a hurricane or anything like it, what are the missions that are likely to be needed? Sheltering certainly is one, and debris management is certainly another one, right? So we can call those up. We can look at the services that comply. We can alert those people. Those services are likely to be needed. Get those things ready. We can perhaps do some just-in-time training or efforts to make that work. And that's how we map all this back to a particular playbook. But we do not have a hurricane annex. We have a hurricane playbook that says, here are the missions. But those missions could be used multiple places. I mean, like David, I do some work with healthcare organizations too. I had a client, nursing home, big operation. They had a severe weather plan. They had a hurricane plan. They had a high heat plan. And on any given day in August, that nursing home, 3 different people could look out the window and invoke 3 different plans, and they'd all be right. And of course, they'd all be wrong because those plans are perhaps conflicting and contradictory or have gaps between them. We need one plan, and the plan is always define what missions we need to invoke and what services we need to put together on there. So I'm going to stop here and invite more questions, and maybe I'll ask you to pull up one of the other slides later, but I think that covers the guts of what we're doing, and I'm hoping for some questions.
Well, I'll say that this is awesome. The way of looking at this and services, I feel like I've had multiple discussions in planning processes of trying to figure out how to do this and haven't been able to pinpoint it. So thank you for sharing. Any from the group, do we have any questions about what works, what doesn't work, how you may or may not be able to take something like this into your planning process? Gonna make me start calling on people.
Liz, I don't have a question, but I'll make a comment that might help lead some discussion. First of all, planning is let's say, those of us that are planners and planning section chiefs are a different breed. But one thing is, if anyone here is newer into planning and really thinks that this is overwhelming, if you look at the names that are here, and there's a lot of people with experience, that's where you reach out to. None of us learn from reading everything. We learn by doing and talking with others. So definitely use this networking with the people in the room here. If you're a member of KEMA, and when we have the conference, other stuff, we work together and talk together. I mean, there's times, I know many of the people here listen and we've talked about, and I see a hand just went up, so I'm going to be quiet. Hopefully that spurred a good conversation.
Sorry, guys, I got stuck on mute. I'm Camille. I'm from Southern California here in Riverside, and I had a question for Rick. Rick, how does the plans that you're describing really work for the healthcare facilities? How does that work with integrating those plans?
Thanks, Camille. Healthcare facilities in the district, well, there are a couple of city-owned hospitals, but for the most part, it's a private and public network of hospitals that are not administered by the city. But we work very closely with them. We work with the DC's Health and Medical Coalition, their preparedness coalition, through the Department of Health. And so they play key roles in some of these plans. It's not essential that a district agency is the lead agency in every service. And certainly those agencies can call on both public, private, regional partners in order to help meet the needs. So if our human services agency is leading in sheltering, they know who they can reach out to at Department of Health and say, we need some medical assessments here. And they may send city people from Department of Health, or they may have an arrangement with a hospital or other healthcare provider to bring those in. We make no distinctions within the plan what comes after the dot after your email address, whether it's dc.gov or somebody.healthcare, it doesn't matter to us. So we spend a lot of time trying to integrate those plans and make sure that we can coordinate, but we do, and that's really what makes it work. Thanks.
Thank you, Rick.
Liz, can I something that Bob said? Bob, I think this is a great point. There's a lot of us on here, not most, who are planners, and we enjoy planning. And I absolutely reach out to your counterparts, your colleagues. But one of the things I found very helpful for myself, and then teaching it as well too, is taking time to actually read and research EOPs that are online. I've spent quite a bit of time looking at the good, the bad, and of course the ugly. And when I teach planning, I tell students there's 3 things that need to be incorporated into plans outside of the actual CPG process. It's following the proper format of the plans, having the proper contents, and aesthetically, plans also need to look good. Now, aesthetically, I think that's the least important, but we all know we've looked at plans before, and it doesn't look professional. So the 3 things that when I teach planning is that make sure you're following the proper structure of the plan that you find in CPG 101. Focus also on the content for the guts of the plan, but also make your plan aesthetically look pleasing. When you're reading it, it's easy to find information. We've all seen those plans where every point is, a page, whereas CPG 101 tells us to be concise, to the point, and not overly filled with detail. We know detail goes into all those annexes. That's what CPG 1 tells us. So, I just echo ultimately what Bob's saying, rely on one another. But if you haven't taken the time, there are hundreds of EOPs online available for us to go through to find, again, look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. Thanks, Bob.
Expand what David just brought up. First of all, the plan has to be realistic. Prior to me working here at Allegheny County Emergency Services, I was a consultant with KEMA on this school planning grant. One EOP for a school district was reviewing and helping them with. They actually used the template for the municipal plans, and they used all ESFs and broke out everything, but they're a small school district. They did not have the staffing to do that. I go, you have, just because a template exists, you also have to make it applicable to your jurisdiction, your organization, and figure out from there. So making sure it's realistic is also important. There are a couple, there's a question or two in the chat. One's for you.
Bob, if you could actually help me and take a look at those. I just had to switch to my iPad. My service isn't great at the moment.
Kathleen put in there for David. What cities or counties have good plans that you would recommend that we read and stands out as good examples?
Sure, I'd have to go back to the classroom. I'll have Liz remind me to do that. I teach it in the fall, but we go through a large number. I have a large number of plans printed out as well as saved. I'll just have to go back because I have them organized. Off the top of my head, I can't think of them, but I can go through Liz, get your information, and share those. But I've reviewed hundreds and hundreds of those plans through class and training. But thanks. I definitely will have to get back to you on one.
Also, Rick, thanks for putting that video. There's a link, a YouTube link for 45-minute video on mission service concept. If you want to expand on that, Rick.
Sure. Actually, Emily, my boss here, is one of the stars of that video where she lays out the concept from start to finish. So I don't know, Emily, if you want to jump on and talk about it, but it features it on all the slides that I showed were pulled from that video. It's really what made me fall in love with it. Emily?
Yeah, thanks, Rick. I think that, well, first to the video, so Rick laid out sort of how the plan itself works, and what you see in the remainder of the video is how that allows you to plug your plan into the remainder of the preparedness cycle. So it talks about plugging it into operations, plugging it into evaluation, plugging it into strategy, plugging it into resourcing and capability building. So it really kind of sets the plan as the foundation for the rest of the activities that you're doing. So you don't end up with this like giant plan that sits on a shelf forever and doesn't necessarily reflect the way operations are working, right? And then the other thing I was going to say, Bob, to your point earlier, you know, ESFs don't work for everybody because not everybody does all of the things that ESFs do. And that's true for all of those different constructs that Rick had up on the screen at the beginning. Like that's too much for some jurisdictions. And particularly when you start talking about hospitals or schools, like some of that is very clearly out of scope. And so one of the ideas behind this services concept that Rick talked about is that you really kind of get to define in your own words for your own program what it is that you do. And you can kind of set the scope yourself without having to try to sort of jimmy it into one of these constructs that might be close, but not quite right. And then once you've defined what those roles are for your organization or your jurisdiction, you can plug them into the various playbooks and missions and other planning activities that you do throughout your process. But it really gets you out of being stuck in some of those national level constructs that just aren't applicable across the board.
Thank you. Another thing I forgot to bring up last time is one thing to remember: a checklist is not a plan. The plan or the checklist comes from the plan. That's one big thing I've had issues from with other committees, whether it's a healthcare coalition, schools, that they just want a checklist. I go, you need to have the plan because that's what you use as your basically legal guidance. You might not pull that off the shelf right away during an incident, but that's what you base your training, your exercises, and everything on. The checklist comes from the trigger points or the benchmarks that are in the plan that might be more operational for those first few hours or first day until you get things going. And I saw some heads bobbing, so if they want to pipe in and add anything to that.
I just really like the building out the services slide that Rick shared. I think that really kind of simplifies it. I know I've had multiple conversations with folks. We all do it where, okay, do I repeat myself in this annex because it already exists somewhere else? So I really like breaking it down to like the pure service function and what the goal of that service is, and then being able to duplicate that for no matter what the incident is. I think that would minimize duplication as well as allow us to more frequently update and maintain them because they're not this large full paragraph document sitting on the shelf. Rick, I'd be curious if maybe in the future you'd be willing to share like at least a snippet of one of your actual plans so we could see what it actually looks like in the document format.
So as any good consultant did, I looked over at Emily's box. I just saw Emily nodding, so I'm going to say yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah, Liz, we have a service plan template and a couple other tools that I can share with you if anyone in the group is interested in what that looks like.
That'd be great. Thank you. All right, I think someone just put something in the chat. Did someone want to talk?
Yes, 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 Cameron. The services is an approach to continuity. We're doing a continuity, a push on continuity planning for our agencies. And one of the things that Emily and I've talked about is the mission essential functions. Let's put it this way. If you're a lead agency on one of our services, that instantly became one of your mission essential functions, right? You have to do that one. Because no matter whether the city or state is falling apart, you still need to deliver that elsewhere. So it does help to define that. And if an agency says, I really don't know where to go with continuity, well, let's look at the services that you provide in a crisis. Those are clearly ones that you need to focus on and wrap your continuity plan around that. And it's exactly what I've been doing the last couple of weeks on a crash basis for an agency as yet another pending incident approaches DC. So yes, exactly right.
This is Shannon Evans from Allegheny County Human Services. I think too, it also then counters with supporting the resiliency and the sustainability of your community itself. Because if everybody is able to be very straightforward with expressing their services that they're able to provide and getting people to clearly understand what those services are prior to disaster, then you're able to do some more forward thinking and see what services are most needed for people as they recover long-term from disaster. Do we meet those needs now? And or how do we start to plan to have funding set aside to be able to pull into account to help address those needs to create that resilient recovery process for all involved, which does create that equitable future and helps us to be able to plan moving forward. So focusing on services is great.
David, maybe you could jump into that. The segue between response and recovery and with respect to planning. I'm eager to hear your thoughts on that.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So if you look at EG 101, and I continually reference that part of the process when I teach emergency operations plan is the demobilization and then into the long-term, I'm sorry, not the long-term, the recovery piece of that. So we know we start recovery planning incident. And so I think we take the same approach in planning as well too. And when I talk to my, especially my private sector clients about recovery, because they tend to be the most unfamiliar with the terms, concepts, and principles that we set forth at emergency planning, they often don't think about the recovery piece because, you know, the scope of what they're undertaking from just the planning for the response piece is too big for them to even bite off, let alone recovery. So I think that's a good question because when we talk about resilience, and I think about the recovery from a continuity of operations perspective, I link those two in my plans because I speak to my organizations when I'm working with them about the importance of being able to sustain their operations during but through the recovery piece of the disaster as well too. And Shannon mentioned equity, and a couple of, what are some of the other terms you mentioned, Shannon, in there?
Equity, resilient, sustainable, being able to create this cohesive network with the community to be able to move forward and recover.
Okay,
And
that's
build back. It's kind of the term of build back better, looking at
Yeah.
it from the broad scope.
so when I was working with the school districts, because the school districts at the end of the day, at the local level, are so intertwined with our local community in terms of individuals, families, groups, networks, etc. And so I think Shannon, what you just mentioned triggered in my mind about the importance of recovery planning. I teach holistic disaster recovery. That concept, we're all familiar with that, across all these different platforms, all these different aspects of community life. So when I'm working with the school district, for example, recovery, I make sure that we focus on those longer term implications of recovery, the mental health of students. And again, I'm just using case study examples of clients I work with. So the mental health implications of disaster, both short, mid, and long term. Talking about the implications if a disaster occurred at a school and the recovery implications for that community. How do you deal with the interconnectedness of that community from the school district standpoint, as well as all the different intricacies and all the different layers of that community that school district touches. And so I don't have the greatest answer for you, and I'm relying upon my work with schools, Rick, but that's, my approach to recovery is both that holistic standpoint, but I tie that into continuity of operations, as well as that notion of just addressing all facets of disaster recovery in the emergency plan. That's how hopefully that answered your question. That's a great question. Caught me a little off guard, but.
So I believe it was our first KEMA coffee break was focused on this, how to do the virtual planning. Because we were in the time of lockdown and everyone was trying to figure out how to do everything virtually. So some of this was discussed in that first one, but what advice do you all have for the past probably year and a half that a lot of the planning processes have been virtual with these key stakeholders? Any advice for getting them fully engaged or giving them read ahead material, any tangible things there? Dave, I know you do a lot of virtual planning. Do you have anything?
Yeah, I do a lot of, recently I'm only starting another process, working with the hospital, developing a novel virus response plan. A lot of that's going to be virtually based. I think the biggest challenge is, it speaks to it right in CPG 101, the whole just engaging the whole planning team and making sure that we can get, number one, of course, the buy-in to it, but the level of interaction, collaboration, and input from everyone equally. That's always been one of my bigger challenges. And it speaks to that in the planning area in the document itself. So I think from my perspective, having worked in starting up this process, especially coming out of Omicron, is the level of engagement that I'm going to be expecting with the client and all the different stakeholder partners across the hospital. And how do you sustain that over, planning is long term. You can't write an emergency operations plan in 1 month. If you do, it's a template and you just fill in the blanks. That's not planning. So trying to sustain, and all of us have been engaged in long-term planning projects, 6, 8, or to 12 months. And so how do you sustain that engagement in a meaningful way is probably one of the biggest challenges I face. I'm sure a lot of you can echo that as well too.
The District of Columbia took COVID very seriously, very early, and I left there 2 years ago this week. I have spent the entire pandemic 300 miles from DC, working sometimes 50 hours a week, especially because I'm one of the few people who in emergency management didn't get sucked up into the response mode, working for all the other agencies and getting them up to speed. So we realized early on we need to continue planning, training, and exercises online. I don't like the word virtual. The only thing that's virtual is our presence. Everything is real. It really happens. planning is very easy to do in an online environment, because if you're in the middle of a conversation and you realize some agency or somebody has a thought that we didn't include, it's so much easier to connect those in than it is to say, oh, gee, maybe we can invite them to come here next week. I find there's a whole lot more collaboration. Now that we've all learned where the mute button is, or most of us anyway, we can do this much more clearly. We do training online. In fact, we've brought some stuff on that FEMA is very excited about, that they've pushed out nationally. I know that Pennsylvania has done some great online training, and not just you sit there and I'll read you the PowerPoint slides that I would have read to you in class. Oh, no, real highly integrated, multimedia, interactive, self-study training. And we can do the same thing with planning. So many of these plans were put together by people who were not anywhere near each other and didn't meet. Same thing for the exercise. We've conducted exercises with 85 participants representing local, federal, other neighbor agencies in Maryland and Virginia, regional entities like the Metro, Airports Authority, all of us, and all of it was done on a WebEx platform or other platforms. So while it took us a while to come to grips with that, I think we're full stream now. And I, for one, am not ready to go back to being limited to an in-person only focus on whether it's planning or training or exercise.
Yeah, I think those are great points. You can certainly squeeze a 15, 20-minute conversation in virtually, or online, I should say, easier than an in-person meeting with a larger group. Any other questions from the group related to planning or best practices? I see Bob shared some tools as well. It looks like.
Yeah, I just put in our basic plan, which is that is public view. Some people were asking about plans, and then I've already had permission, because there's nothing really secret in our EOC operations annex, which is actually devised. We switched from the ICS mode to the incident support model. So that is in the incident support model. So if anyone's thinking about making that change, that's something that they can consider. So I've already had permissions to share that publicly. So that's in there.
Great, thank you. And Amy, I'm assuming you can get all the comments and all the links, and then we can share them out afterwards. It's recorded, so I assume so. Dave or Rick, was there any parts of your initial presentation we didn't get to that you wanted to summarize real quick?
Watch the video and then ask questions. Ask me if you still got questions. That's really the source.
Okay. Dave?
I think you had a question in the email between Rick, you and I, about starting from scratch versus revision. So just wondering how people, I've typically started from scratch almost on all my projects. I know, I'm just curious about any experiences going into a revision versus starting from scratch. I follow tradition, or the function focused format to a T, CPG 101 to a T. Just wondering what other folks' experiences with a revision, especially working with your colleagues you might have worked with for a long time, what challenges or benefits there might be to that versus just working with a new client or new stakeholder. Putting that one up.
All right, I'm going to pick on someone. Bob Ross or Josh Walter. I think I saw both of you on. I know that you have worked through many plan revisions, so any comments there?
Gee, Liz, I'll remember this. No, I think you got the benefit of one of the things about planning is you never know it all the time, and so I appreciate Rick's and Dave's presentations on how they use it. Particularly interested in Rick's, so I'm going to take a look at that on his YouTube channel. But I think planning, as I've worked with a lot of different folks in my career, planning, you can teach anybody to plan, but there is something special about finding the right person that's a planner, and they are the folks that inherently will know the right questions to ask at the right time and in the right part of the discussion. And so I think being tuned in to making sure that we understand the client's needs or your own organization's needs, and it all starts there.
Couldn't agree more. Sorry to put you on the spot, but I had to. All right, well, I think we're gonna wrap it up. Does anyone have any final thoughts before we do? Okay, well, I want to thank Rick and Dave, both of you, for sharing this great information. I think this was a really good discussion. And thank you to everyone that participated. I learned a lot, and I hope you all did too.